Hi everyone, welcome back to Steve's Garage. In today's video, I'm working on a Mark IV Volkswagen with a 1.8T, and I'll be replacing the power steering lines. I don't have the first-hand knowledge of working on other engine models to say this for sure, but looking at part diagrams, the systems look very similar across the board. If you watch this video and you're working on something other than a 1.8T, feel free to leave a comment and let others know how helpful it was. I'll be covering both lines in this video. The first is your feed line or high pressure line. It runs from your power steering pump around the front of your engine and terminates at the rack. The return or low pressure line runs from your steering rack across it to the passenger side and then up to the power steering fluid reservoir. There's also a hose that runs from the reservoir down to your power steering pump. It's a very easy replacement, and I do quickly touch on that in the video. I'll be installing lines that I purchased from EAA Engineering. They look a little different, but the procedure and sizes are the exact same as OEM. If you elected to go with the OEM style, definitely still check out the install portion of this video and let me know if you have any questions. If you're familiar with my videos, you know that I like to cover all the tools I use before we get started, so let's do that now. 13mm sockets, 7/8 socket, and crowfoot. These can also be 22. They're interchangeable. In my case, I didn't have a 22, but I had the 7/8, so either one will work. Ratchet, a bunch of small extensions or one long one. 19mm wrench, a pair of pliers for a hose clamp. Probably don't need these. I use them to try to not make a mess of power steering fluid, but they're not a must-have. New power steering fluid. You don't want to reuse the old stuff. And this 18mm wrench is here if you're doing the EAA lines. If you're doing the OEM lines or the EAA lines, everything is the same except the 18. You just need that 18 for the EAA. You won't need it for the OEM. You want to start by disconnecting the plug on the power steering pressure sensor switch. It's a typical Volkswagen plug. Just depress that tab, pull back, and it should slide right off. As for removing the pressure switch, you can fit a socket over it. It just doesn't leave you a lot of room to get the ratchet in there and actually crack it loose. If you use a crowfoot, you get the offset and ability to add extensions. That way you can have room to work. The banjo bolt holding the line to the power steering pump is also a 7/8 or 22, but with the switch out of the way, you can actually get a socket on there. It was impossible to get a camera and my hands in there to remove the banjo bolt. That's why I went in from underneath. You shouldn't have to. It's absolutely accessible from up above and probably easier than climbing underneath the car. Moving down the line to the driver's side, you can find this little bracket. It's removed with a 13mm. Again, I'm going in from the bottom just for the camera angle. You should be able to remove this from the top, and it's probably easier than climbing underneath the car. In fact, you can even see at the end here that I reach down right by the upper rad hose and have more than enough room to grab that bolt out. For the next bracket, you do have to get under the car. It's on the bottom driver's side of the transmission. Again, a 13mm bolt. I like to take it out of that bracket and put it in my coffee can or bucket, whatever you're using for your safekeeping of hardware. If I leave it in there, it can fall out and then disappear in the garage. As far as the feed line is concerned, you're now at the rack. The problem is that I couldn't find a way to get a wrench on that bolt without removing the return line first. If you want, you can go back up to the reservoir and work your way down on the return line like we did with the feed line, but I was already under here and I wanted to get the feed line out, and if that meant removing the return line from the rack, that's what I was going to do first. So here I'm disconnecting both the return and the feed lines from the rack, and then I'll remove the rest of the return line next. It is a pretty tight spot. It's a little difficult to get your tools and hands in there, but again, it's made more difficult by trying to film this at the same time. You can see that feed line looks pretty rough. It was also leaking up by the power steering pump, which is why I'm under here replacing it all. If you have any questions about diagnosing your power steering system in your Mark IV, leave a comment and I can try to help you out. Starting at the rack and moving up the line towards the reservoir, the bracket is located after your downpipe and before the fender well. To the right of the bolt location, you can see the downpipe. To the left, you see the boot for the inner tie rod, and then you can also make out the red axle down there, so that should give you an idea of where to locate it. You can see that I'm going from underneath on this one, and that probably is the easiest method. With how close it is to the firewall and the angle of it, it's easier to get under the car and access it than try to go in from the top. There's only that single clamp or bracket holding the return line on, so once you're done with that, head back up to the power steering fluid reservoir. You can remove the hose clamp, slide the hose off, and you're good to take everything out. Side note about those line clamp or pinch off pliers, you don't really need them. There's not a lot of fluid in the line because it's the top of the system and the system is off. I had them on there because I wasn't sure, but like I said earlier in the tool breakdown, it's not really necessary. The return line is mostly a hard line that runs across the car. The rubber section is only the last little bit. Because of that, it does take some finesse to get it out. It's not impossible, you just have to keep working at it. I found the best way was to go underneath the car, just keep moving it and orienting it until you can get it out. The last thing I want to cover is the hose that runs from your reservoir down to your power steering pump. I've seen this part referred to as a suction hose, a supply hose, or a reservoir hose. I went to Volkswagen's website to look for the proper name and part number to make this video, and it looks like they no longer sell it. You should be able to get it from other part suppliers. Hopefully this screenshot can help with part numbers. I'll also leave them down below in the description in case you want to copy and paste them and do your own searching. I know I'm kind of glossing over it here, but it's really just as simple as removing the hose clamp from the reservoir, following it down to the power steering pump, remove that hose clamp, pull the hose out, put the new one in. If you're here doing the other lines, this one's a cakewalk. This next portion of the video pertains to assembly of the EAA lines, so if you went with the OEM style, feel free to skip to the next chapter. That'll be the install of the lines, and no matter which style you went with, it's pretty much the same thing. I'm doing it on the workbench for two reasons. One, so you can see it, and two, because it'll be easier to get it oriented correctly and put together here, and then I can just snug it up once it's on the car. Starting with the low pressure line, it comes off the rack in this direction, so this is the direction that you want the fitting to go. The banjo bolt is going to go in this way, tighten this down, snug it up, and you're ready to install. As for the high pressure line, the fitting needs to face this way because it's coming off the rack and has to go around the transmission. The pump side goes on top of the pump and it has to go down and around and clear it before it travels across the car, so it has to face this way. Again, you don't have to do this on the workbench, but I will say it was pretty easy to install everything here, at least loosely, and then bring it all under the car, make any final tweaks and adjustments, and fully tighten it down once it was all in place. And now it's time for the reinstallation. I'll do my best to differentiate between installing OEM and EAA, but if I miss something or you have a question, just leave it down below. You can go in any order you want, but I'm going to start up top at the reservoir and install the low pressure line. I'm not putting the hose clamp on because the orientation may be off. I might have to rotate the whole hose to get it to fit onto the rack. You'd have a better idea of where the orientation needs to be with the OEM hose because it goes into the hard line, but with both hoses you might have to do some tweaking and rotating, so it's best to leave the hose clamp off. If you do leave it off, just remember to install it before you turn the car on and start pressurizing the system. Next, I'm going to do the high pressure or feed line at the pump. I wanted to do it this way because then I'm doing both lines at the rack at the same time. The EAA kit came with new crush washers for the whole system. If you go the OEM route, make sure you buy new crush washers. Don't reuse the old ones and end up springing a leak in your new power steering system because you decided to save a few bucks on a handful of washers. There should be a crush washer on each side of the banjo bolt and it should thread in nice and easily by hand, and then you just want to tighten it with the tool at the end. The reason it looks like I'm struggling so much here is because I'm trying to do the work and get a camera angle. You can see at the end that I just gave up and tightened it with my hand and tool in the way. If you're not trying to film this, it should go pretty easy and shouldn't have any trouble. While you're here, you can also install your pressure switch. Just make sure that that line is tight because everything stacks on top of itself. And now it's time to move to the rack. You'll notice that my axle isn't there. I was doing some other work on the car. It was out. I don't think it's necessary to take the axle out of the car to do the power steering lines. It helped that it wasn't there, but it's not impossible to do it if it was. For anyone that's done this kind of work before where you're trying to thread a banjo bolt through a fitting and two crush washers and get it to engage, it can be a real big pain, especially when you're kind of working blind and at a weird angle. I thought I had the wrong bolt or something. I mean, it was just a mess. You can see this video that it just took me forever to get it. It will go in. Remember to do it by hand. Don't use a ratchet. Don't use a power tool because if you cross thread something, now you've got to pull the rack out. I did end up loosening the fitting a little bit and repositioning it just so that it would clear the axle and get to all the OEM mounting points. It wasn't a big deal at all. It was just me being overly cautious because the axle wasn't in the car. If the axle was in the car, it's really easy to confirm that it's not interfering with it. And again, if you went with the OEM style lines, this isn't even a concern. The return line or low pressure line gave me the same struggle, but I'm not going to bore you with that again. Just remember to hand thread it and tighten it down at the end. Here's an overview of how the high pressure line is run once it's fully installed. I don't have footage of it with the axle in, but it does clear it, and I haven't had any issues with it rubbing or contacting. Moving down the line, it uses all the OEM mounting points, so whether you're installing the EAA or the OEM lines, they're going to attach back up to the car the same way. I still have my SAI pump, so the power steering line goes under the suction hose and then into the power steering pump. The low pressure or return line is the same deal. It uses that OEM mounting point, which is perfect. You're going to struggle with it because the angle is weird and you're going in blind, but it is what it is. At this point, double check your work, make sure your hose clamps are on, your banjo bolts are tight, and then we're ready to add some power steering fluid and bleed the system. So get under your hood, crack open that power steering fluid reservoir. You're going to see there's a dipstick attached to it with a min and a max line, and that's your scale of how much power steering fluid to add. You want to add enough to the reservoir that it fills up to the max line, and then we can go start the car and start bleeding the system. Because we didn't replace the pump or the rack, there's no reason to prime anything. There's still fluid in those items, and you're not going to damage anything by turning the car on. All we're doing is replacing the fluid that was in the reservoir and the lines, and of course, purging the air out of the new lines. Bleeding the power steering can be done with the front wheels on or off the ground. Technically, dry steering with the wheels on the ground and not moving does cause more wear and tear, but you're not going to ruin anything by doing this a few times to bleed your power steering system. So get in your car, start it up, and then turn the steering wheel full lock in both directions. All the way to the left, all the way to the right, back to center, and then check your fluid level. If you add fluid, you should do one more round of full lock-to-lock turns. You really want to make sure that there's no air trapped in that system. It's also a good time to poke your head under the car and make sure none of the fittings are leaking. They're all under pressure, so it's going to be pretty obvious if one is. You're not going to really have to look that hard. There's probably going to be power steering fluid everywhere. Once you feel comfortable, take the car out on the road, drive it around the block, make sure everything feels good, is working correctly, and then when you come back, check your fluid level one final time. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, think about subscribing. Leave any questions or comments you have below and check out the description for details on part numbers and links and things like that. Click the playlist here for more Mark IV how-to videos. Thanks so much for watching, everybody.